I thought I'd come on here today and talk about this amazing thing that you should have two of if you're lucky in your body, and this is called a shoulder blade. This is a shoulder blade or a scapula. This is your arm bone. It's not your arm bone, it's my model arm bone, which is called a humerus. So this is the posterior view. If you remember, posterior is the back. So if you can imagine, that's my shoulder blade there, and that's my arm there. So this is the posterior view of the shoulder blade, and this is this amazing kind of bony ridge which is called the spine of the scapula. And if you place your hand on the opposite shoulder, and on top of this squidgy kind of muscular part on top that you can feel gets quite tense, you can actually kind of feel and palpate this bony ridge on top of the scapula, and that's called the spine of the scapula. So that's the spine of the scapula, and this is the posterior side of the scapula, so the back side of the scapula. So if you think about this being over here, this is going to be the outside edge because that's where the arm bone is. So this border of the scapula is called the medial border, because if you remember, we learned that the medial is close to the midline. So it's closest in to the midline, the center of my body, which is the spine. So this is the medial border, which means this side of the scapula is the lateral border. So that's like the side that's closest to the outside where the arm is. So we have the medial border of the scapula, we have the lateral border of the scapula, and we have the spine of the scapula. And then this little angle here, there's two angles, an angle at the top and an angle at the bottom. And if you remember, we call the top bit the superior angle and the bottom bit the inferior angle. So that's why we learn these anatomical terms like medial, lateral, superior and inferior. So we have the spine of the scapula, we have the inferior angle, superior angle, medial border and lateral border of the scapula. And this is the posterior view. And if I flipped it, this here would be the anterior view, which is the front of the scapula. So that's like if you're looking at me through my ribs, you took my ribs away, that's what you'd see, the anterior. So that's the front side of the shoulder blade, which you can't see. And if you imagine, it's actually between the ribs. The anterior view is kind of like the ribs are on top of it. So if you're looking through me, you'll see through and behind my ribs, you'll see the anterior. So looking at the posterior view again, we have the spine of the scapula, and we have these caves. So there's a lovely cave here, and the cave is the fossa. So a fossa is this kind of like nice cave, and then you have a lovely cave on top as well, on top of the spine of the scapula. So these are called fossas, and this fossa is called the Infraspinatus Fossa. So that means it's inferior to or below the spine of the scapula. So it's the cave that is below the spine of the scapula. So we call that the Infraspinatus Fossa. So what do you think the top one is called? This is the cave that is above the spine of the scapula. So this fossa is called the Supraspinatus Fossa. And these are really good names because fossa is cave, supra is above, spinatus means is referring to the spine of the scapula. So we have the infraspinatus fossa, the supraspinatus fossa, and then underneath, or the front of the shoulder blade, but if you think about it as underneath, that's called the subscapularis, so sub as in submarine, under, subscapularis fossa. Okay, and these fossas are going to give us a clue as to what the muscles are called. So the muscle that sits on the infraspinatus fossa is called the infraspinatus muscle. The muscle that sits on the top of the space on top of the spine of the scapula is called the supraspinatus. And the muscle that sits on the subscapularis fossa is called the subscapularis muscle. And these three are part of the cuff, the rotator cuff, that kind of angle the top of the head of the humerus, we call it. This is the humerus bone, and it's got this kind of like round knobbly bit which we call the head of the humerus. And so the infraspinatus underneath the spine of the scapula joins from the medial border of the scapula and joins the top of the head of the humerus. The subscapularis is kind of the mirror image of that, going from the medial border to the front of the humerus, the head of the humerus, and the supraspinatus fossa goes through this little hole and grabs hold of the top of the head of the humerus. And between them, their job is to angle that head of the humerus to let it sit snugly in its joint. And they work with another muscle called the teres minor, which also, it works like the infraspinatus, but rather than joining on the medial border, it joins on the lateral border, and it hooks in. So these form the rotator cuff, these four muscles: infraspinatus, supraspinatus, subscapularis, and little help from teres minor. And they all hook to the very top of the head of the humerus, so they're not really into much movement. Their job is to just get that head of the humerus to sit snugly in its socket, which is called the glenoid fossa. So it's another fossa, another cave, just like your golf tee. And between them, their job as the rotator cuff is to literally cuff the very head of the humerus. They're kind of working between each other to kind of grab that head of the humerus and let it sit snugly. And that's why when people present with kind of rotator cuff injuries, usually it's because they put their hand behind their back to do up or undo their bra or to do something behind them, and they feel really, really nasty pull, and they go to the doctors and they say, it's this movement that is giving me jip, and the doctor says, oh, you've got a rotator cuff injury. And that's because the head of the humerus has been pulled off its little socket, and you are going to have a few problems there with these tiny little stabilizing muscles. They're very, very deep. So there we go.